there are so many different understandings of what woke even is, depending on who you even speak to, that it basically means nothing anymore. I really don't think that is part of woke culture at all. I just think that they have different understandings of society, and now this is just factually incorrect. And I think you'll find I am not transgender. To say that this somehow undermines Western values is completely nonsensical. Now, Konstantin Kisin, I think that's how you pronounce his name, I don't know, and I can't be bothered to look it up. He's been going viral on Twitter, and he's titled the same segment, "Comedian Leaves Oxford Union Speechless," with the title, "Show this speech to a woke person." So I've actually seen this speech already. This is not going to be a first-time reaction. I saw it go viral on Twitter, and I listened in because I was intrigued as to what he said. Right now, if you don't know who Konstantin Kisin is, he is the host of a podcast on YouTube called Trigonometry. Now, let's be real. This is the most cringe fucking title for any channel you've ever seen in your life, and so completely devoid of any originality. It's literally could have been like a crappy Netflix comedy special where they've just said, well, I wanted to make a name for my podcast which had a word that's popular at the moment online called triggered or being triggered. What's a word that has trigger in it? What about trigonometry? Does that work? Do we do anything related to maths? No, but it's got the word trigger in it. That's literally it. That's all of the thought that went into naming this podcast, right? It's so unbelievably cringe, and again, it just shows you how artless and unable to come up with a single original thought loads of kind of conservatives are. But well, there you go. Anyway, he did this speech. Apparently, I think it was an Oxford Union debate about wokeness. Again, this nebulous concept that the right can't even fucking define. I mean, I will define it as their opposition to utilitarian moral philosophy, but I believe that there are so many different understandings of what woke even is, depending on who you even speak to, that it basically means nothing anymore. It's completely meaningless. So anyway, we're going to watch the speech. I'm going to respond to the points that he makes, because he makes a lot of really, really poor points in the speech. So yeah, without further ado.
You will not know this. You will not know this, but I was supposed to be the first non-student speaker for the proposition. I've now been the fourth, which means that I now have to thank all the previous speakers for making my best points for me. And I find that the main reason now that I have left to be in support of the motion is that I am so tired of talking about woke culture. That's why.
Okay, have you considered shutting up then? Like, I'm sorry to be blunt and rude, but if we don't want to talk about woke stuff, just don't bother. Talk about an issue that actually matters.
It's gone too far, more than anything else. And I thank the other speakers for making the points for me.
Has Oxford Union always invited clueless clowns? I mean, to be fair to the Oxford Union, I have lots of criticisms of the incestuous nature of the Oxford Union, but they are happy to bring on basically anybody to be challenged in quote-unquote marketplace of ideas. It just gets elevated too highly because of where Oxford lies in the kind of hierarchy of the UK. It is held up as this specific institution rather than just another university, which is basically what it is. So, to be fair, I think that they do a good job of giving anybody a platform and allowing their views to be challenged under the rules of the Oxford Union Debating Society, which is fine, I guess. Like, Tommy Robinson's spoken, but so has Akala. Like, there's been push-pull. People from loads of different disciplines have spoken in the Oxford Union when they've been having debates or been doing speeches, things like that. So, you know, there are worse things for them to do than invite on people like this.
Because it means I don't have to reiterate the point that no, free speech is not some right-wing reframing of whatever. It's the foundation of Western civilization. Upon this civilization is built, and the Enlightenment value.
I mean, the problem is that, again, this conversation happens every single time you speak to someone who advocates for free speech. Everyone agrees in free speech, but we all have different lines to which we would think that certain kinds of speech goes too far. There are probably only a very, very few numbers of people who believe in genuine overall free speech rights, to be honest. Like, there is always going to be some level of speech that we do curtail within a society. Unless, like, and to be fair, the United States is very unique in the way that it has its First Amendment, but it still doesn't protect you from certain things that you might even say. Even under First Amendment rights, there are still certain things that get where the usage of your speech can be in somewhat restricted, and we all tend to agree on these things. Like, for example, fire in a crowded theatre. I know it's an often used and an interestingly sourced canard for people to use, but there is always this understanding, even if it's not on some kind of legal sense, but it's also in a kind of culturally reinforced sense. And let's be real, it's cultural reinforcement of what free speech is that we're talking about here. For example, very few people are getting, thrown in prison for the things they do or don't say by the state. I think, for example, there are plenty of cases where the left and the right fully agree on this stuff. Like, for example, remember Count Dankula actually got a criminal record for the Nazi pug salute? Right? That is a ridiculous infringement on free speech rights, and the state should not be getting involved in that kind of stuff, regardless of how cringe Count Dankula or that video were. But when people like this man here talk about free speech, they're not, the vast majority of the time, they are not talking about the actual state engaging in censorship, or the state taking you to prison or giving you a criminal record for things that you actually say. What they are talking about is people being deplatformed or disinvited or being shouted down or being told they can't say certain things in a cultural context, which that you can be, right? One of the other important parts of enlightenment and liberal values is freedom of association. If you, as a private platform, for example, like on Twitter, if they don't want to associate with you, they don't have to. They have the ability, their free rights under liberal enlightenment values, to be able to terminate your account on Twitter so that you don't have access to their services. That's a free association that they are now not engaging in, which is not the same as the state power being used to curtail your right to free speech. Now, do I think that, for example, big tech platforms like Twitter have too much power? I 100% agree. I absolutely agree. But that's not a free speech issue. That's an issue with the fact that we have huge amounts of our society dominated by a very small number of incredibly rich people. And that's a whole other discussion to have on for another day. But overall, again, I think this kind of fundamental free speech point that he's making here kind of obscures the fact of whether we're talking about state enforcement of free speech or whether we're actually talking about a cultural consensus we have about things that you can or can't say. Because the vast majority of the time when people on the right talk about this stuff, they're talking about the latter rather than the former.
That led to it. I don't have to make the point that has been made by far better people in the past, that the only way to deal with the problem of racism is to treat people on the content of their character and nothing else. And the fact that woke culture seeks to overturn that is a new form of racism that we must all oppose. It means also I will not use...
Now again, the issue again is, now there are certain parts of this statement that he's just made that I kind of agree with, and I think that we cause more problems than we solve with the framings of certain issues. For example, this kind of nebulous difference that people have between systemic racism and racism by saying that by creating a definition of racism that explicitly only includes systemic racism, and that if it's not part of a systemic level of racism, then it doesn't count as real racism. And I think that's a silly distinction, because everyone knows what you mean when you do make a distinction between systemic and colloquial racism. But by othering people from, members of the dominant power group in society, through language like you can't be a victim of racism because you're white, that does nothing. It's entirely a semantic difference, but it's not good optically, and it's not good when you're trying to do outreach to these people. If someone's been a victim of some kind of prejudice on the color of their skin because they are part of a dominant part of the dominant power group, their being part of a dominant power group isn't going to make them feel better in that moment, and so it's going to be difficult to win these people over to your point of view. So I do think there is some truth to that, but unfortunately, it's very difficult to ensure that everyone is treated by the content of their character when society is entirely shaped by, as what I'm sure all the right-leaning people in the comments are going to say when I post this video, are unconscious biases, which are shaped by the overall superstructure of society. And until we forcibly break down those things, it's going to be difficult to beat racism, because it's going to continue to make a bunch of cultural assumptions that are very difficult to be able to break out of. One of the issues is when people allege anti-white racism, there's almost never any actual prejudice at play. But that's true. I do think that is true, Great Night Jay. But there are definitely plenty of instances of people being treated worse because they have white skin, for example, and progressive people not taking it seriously or not taking the person seriously. Even if you genuinely don't believe that that the overall harm that's being meted out by that individual act of racism aren't particularly high, that doesn't mean that you need to disregard the feelings of the person who's feeling bad because they've had prejudice. People have been prejudiced against them. I think that's an issue.
This opportunity to say, I told you so, as someone who spent the last 5 years warning people in the West that if we continue to erode our culture, if we continue to undermine our confidence in Western values, that our enemies like Vladimir Putin will seek to capitalize on it. I will not make any of those points tonight, at all.
Also, again, people say, oh, we're losing Western culture or Western values. This goes back to the ContraPoints video on Jordan Peterson talking about how the postmodern neo-Marxists are undermining Western values. When he's talking about this kind of stuff, so clearly Konstantin is talking here in the sense that what people would kind of go back to, I guess, critical theory and postmodernism, and the way they look at power structures rather than the kind of classical liberal values that Mr. Kisin espouses, right? There's a big difference between these two. But postmodernism and Marxism, even though they obviously are not congruent theories, they're incongruent views of society, because one is postmodernist and one is modernist, right? For example, they're not going to be ever mutually inclusive because they completely disagree with each other. And also, most postmodernism does not believe in materialism, but that's a story for another day. These are Western values. The Enlightenment values are Western values, but postmodernist values that this guy clearly disagrees with, these are also Western values. Like the Frankfurt School and the critical theory that these people rally against, these are Western theories of the way we think about philosophy. To say that this somehow undermines Western values is completely nonsensical. And if you're talking about eroding culture, which a lot of the time, I don't know whether he specifically means this right now, but because obviously he's moving on to a different subject entirely. When you talk about eroding culture, most people will use that to mean that we are importing too many immigrants from different cultures into our countries in the West. That's a common theme of reasoning, especially on the right wing at the moment, about the breaking down of Western culture through people moving to Western countries from usually countries in the East and usually Muslims. But the funny part is that second-generation immigrants tend to actually adapt to Western culture and Western values pretty easily. We have seen it, especially in America. Less so, for example, in some European countries, but certainly in America, the second-generation immigrants of Muslim families are actually really progressive. And the evidence will show you that the more time that you have the more time you have these first-generation immigrants staying around people within the West. Sorry, second generation. I spent the entire time saying first. I meant second generation immigrants, for example. They actually do become culturally assimilated, which is a word I hate, but that's the kind of the colloquial understanding of that term. They do become culturally assimilated in that regard. So the idea that they're undermining Western culture is just completely nonsensical. I do think there is issues that we have with, for example, enclaves forming, but there are policies that you can do to try and mitigate this. And overall, over time, these people do become quote-unquote westernized, again, which I don't like, but as a term. But this would be something that I think someone who already agrees with Kisin would understand what I mean when I say.
Instead, I am not going to talk to those of you who already agree with me, which I imagine is most of you. I'm not going to talk to you because I imagine after everything you've heard tonight, you're going to vote for the proposition. I'm going to confess I will take your vote for granted. Tonight, I am the Labour Party and you are the Red Wall. Now, I want to talk to those of you who are woke and who are open to rational argument. A small minority, I accept.
What's interesting as well is I don't think the Red Wall voted for Boris Johnson because of cultural issues. I think, what do you think levelling up was as an economic policy, if not to be able to funnel money into forgotten northern constituencies in the Red Wall? For a bunch of people who already have material interest in voting for the Conservative Party, as these are areas with higher levels of home ownership, especially amongst the older members of that society who are more likely to be property owners too. Like demographically, these areas are a lot older than, like, for example, central urban areas that tend to most of the time vote Labour.
Because one of the tenets of wokeness is, of course, that your feelings matter more than the truth. But I believe in you. I believe there are those of you here who are woke.
Do they? I genuinely hear this all the time. Like, I remember reading an article that tried to define wokeness, and it did a really bad job of it. But one of the points that it had at the center of wokeness was that feelings matter more than facts, which
Because I'm literally a communist.
which I really don't think that is part of woke culture at all. I just think that they have different understandings of society, and they conflict with a classical liberal and or conservative worldview. Like, this isn't necessarily that this is someone's feelings are overriding facts overall. It just is a different because these people have wildly different moral philosophies. These people have wildly different understandings of society. Like, most conservatives believe in kind of idealism, whereas I would be a materialist, and most other leftists are materialists. Like, they get the idea there's some kind of true human rationality rather than just different perspectives. Again, a lot of things that a bunch of classical liberals would disagree with, because that's a very postmodernist thing for me to say. I don't think that really holds true. The wokeism is defined by feelings over facts. I think he's just spent too much time listening to Ben Shapiro. I think the feelings versus truth argument is weak and is used as a pejorative. 100% agree, Scribby, yeah.
Who are open to rational arguments, so let me make one.
And also the idea that emotions are irrational is also just kind of nonsensical as well. Again, I'm probably rambling, and this is clearly a digression, but I think it's worth saying that emotions are rational. Like, if something bad happens to you, it's rational to feel upset. It's rational to feel angry, right? And for example, if you look at injustice, wanting to see justice being done, that's a rational way of looking at things, and at least in my view, it is. I know people disagree. That's true, Ziad. Emotions can be rational responses. They can become irrational, but there are plenty of things where your emotional response is a rational one.
We are told that your generation cares more than any other about one issue in particular, and that issue is climate change. We're told that many of you suffer from climate anxiety. You wish to save the planet. And for tonight, and tonight only, I will join you. I will join you in worshipping at the feet of Saint Greta of climate change.
Also, I know that's just a joke, but I keep seeing this kind of point of view from the right wing that somehow leftists view Greta Thunberg as some kind of prophet, rather than what I believe she's an activist. She's an activist who puts her point of view across and tries to get people involved in wanting to agitate for political change from the political parties who have the reins of power in deciding whether or not pro-environmental economic policy is being pushed within the public sector, at the very least. Although, also, is he saying that he? I think he might also be saying he doesn't believe in climate change, but he's clearly not so stupid that he doesn't believe in climate change. So there was a really weird wording from him there.
Let us all accept right here, right now, that we are living through a climate emergency and our stocks of polar bears are running extremely low. I join you in this view. I truly do. Now, what are we to do about this huge problem facing humanity? What can we in Britain do? We can only do one thing. You know why? This country...
Actually, funny, the person talking about how, like, the anti-woke fact-based brigade always run with, like, cherry-pick statistics and single-valued interpretation of those individual statistics too. There's a really funny Reddit post going around. Obviously, it's just some random off Reddit rather than some kind of figurehead of the right-leaning ideological viewpoint, where they were saying literally, how do we beat the left? The left continue arguing with me by quoting statistics and studies, and the problem is science is biased, so it makes the left look like they're winning when they're not. How do I beat them when it looks like they're being rational when they actually aren't? And I'm like, no, if the science agrees with the left, it's not because the science is biased, it means that you're wrong. Like, there's a reason why leftists rely on studies all the time. r/self-aware-wolves, true. You beat the left with money, it turns out, also true.
Is responsible for 2% of global carbon emissions, which means that if Britain was to sink into the sea right now, it would make absolutely no difference to the issue of climate change. You know why? Because the future of the climate is going to be decided in Asia and in Latin America by poor people who couldn't give a shit about saving the planet.
Now, this is just factually incorrect. It's just absolutely factually incorrect. I mean, you're saying the poor people in Latin America don't care about environmentalism. Well, those same poor people that elected Gabriel Boric, that elected Gustavo Petro, that elected Lula, that elected AMLO, like, the Latin American countries are like a hotbed of leftist activism right now. And the people who elect these leftists are mostly poor people. And these are kind of people who care about the environment. This is... Of all of the areas of the world you could use as an example where poor people do not care about the environment, choosing Latin America as one of those countries is just the most it's the most colossally untrue thing you could possibly do. What's it like? Literally, we're seeing the biggest leftist insurgency in Latin America in history. And you're telling me now that poor people just don't care about the environment? They couldn't give a shit about climate change? That's just, like, factually untrue.
No, thank you. No, thank you. It's going to be decided by poor people in Asia and Latin America who don't care about saving the planet. You know why? Because they're poor.
Literally, poor people in Chile have to... their environments are being destroyed. Like the Mapuches in Chile, their environment is being destroyed, or was being destroyed before Boric took charge. For example, in Chile, and it's like, and you look at Chile, you look at the Atacama Desert, which is festooned with abandoned and discarded and landfilled clothes from this sea of fast fashion in the Atacama Desert. The people who really care about that are the poor people who aren't the ones engaging in conspicuous consumption. He's ignoring who creates the demand for the high pollution activity in Asia. That is true, but I think we'll come on to that in a second.
Poor. Because they're poor. I come from Russia, which is not a poor country, it's a middle-income country. 20% of households in Russia do not have an indoor toilet. What they have is an outdoor toilet. And I don't mean one of those nice portaloos that we get here. I don't even mean a Glastonbury portaloo. I mean a wooden shack with a hole in the ground that holds a collected fermented memory of the last 10,000 visits. How many of you are going to go home tonight and say, let's rip out our bathroom and erect a Siberian shithouse in the back garden? And if you're not, why should they? 120 million people in China do not have enough food.
I don't get that point that he's made. Maybe I'm just thick. Yeah, exactly, my range. I don't get the point. Like, is he somehow saying that having an indoor toilet is like climate negative? Is that the point that he's trying to make? It seems like a massive non sequitur. Absolutely, Comrade Jock. I really don't get his point here. Maybe it's just gone right over my head and I'm an idiot. I'm fully willing to accept that might be the case of what's going on here, but I genuinely do not get this man's point. Because we literally could retrofit all of these people's houses in Russia if the state even cared about doing so. But it doesn't, because Russia is a gigantic kleptocracy because of the shock doctrine of the 90s. I think he thinks that climate activists are wanting everyone to be poor, massive strawman, just like all the other claims. Well, true. He thinks that anything that reduces carbon emissions is the automatic denial of creature comforts and luxuries. And that's the frustrating... It was literally what we were talking about before, how the kind of prevailing view of leftist philosophy is somehow entirely built around degrowth, when it really isn't. Again, I mean, there are very few countries where actual leftist, at least political parties, maybe not activist groups, but definitely political parties. There are no leftist political parties running on a degrowth platform. Let's be real.
I don't mean that they don't get dessert. I mean they suffer from malnutrition. That means that their immune system is breaking down because they don't have enough food.
Now, this is a point about, I think I cut this off halfway through, but he said, I think it was 150 million people in China are food insecure. Now that's a shit ton of people. But then you also realize that China has the biggest population of any fucking country in the world. Unless you're doing this per capita, you are deliberately trying to make the numbers look worse than they are. If you look at the global hunger index, China ranks very similar to Europe, actually almost identically to, high-income European countries. Like the Hu Jintao era of economic growth in China explicitly got them to the point at which they are also not actually seeing higher levels of food insecurity. Like China is less food insecure than like European countries, than some European countries, for example. Like it's less food insecure than Belarus, which obviously I know it's not exactly the highest echelons of food security. But even outside of that, the idea that China is some kind of gigantically poor country full of emaciated people, when on the global hunger index it ranks pretty highly. It's just, again, unfortunately, Mr. Kissin's feelings, disagree somewhat with the actual facts. I think so. The global health index runs on a scale of 0 to 50. I think Belarus was about a 6.5, which is, and China was a less than 5. So low on the global hunger index scale is better, and higher is worse. So Belarus was like around a 6.5, and China was less than 5. UK also ranks as less than 5 on the global hunger index. I know the video's moved on, but I really don't understand how this guy doesn't realise that if every low emission share country when our 2% doesn't matter, then we'd still have we'd still have like 46% of the current emissions based on what you can find. Like exactly. It's this really weird point of view where everyone, like, this the kind of point of view of somebody who says, oh well, I won't vote, it doesn't make a difference. Well, if nobody voted, then there wouldn't be a democracy. Everyone has to be able to pitch in on a kind of rule utilitarian basis. Because if one person gives we don't contribute enough to warrant a justification for us engaging in it, then all of the rest of the other actors in that system have that same justification, and then the entire agreement then breaks down. Like, do you think that, for example, the Kyoto Protocol, I believe it was, that was banning chlorofluorocarbons, do you think that any of the countries within the Kyoto Protocol said, or was it the Vancouver Protocol, I forget, one of the two, that went up and said, well, actually, our country only uses 0.01% of all the CFCs in the world, so I don't think we should agree to this particular environmental protocol. And then the whole thing would break down, because then everyone else wouldn't agree. It was the whole point that every single signatory, which is essentially global at that point, all agreed to remove the use of chlorofluorocarbons. It was everyone engaging in that, in the overall collective desire to be able to achieve that aim, that made sure that it actually passed. Yes, it was Vancouver, not Kyoto. Zeod, thank you for correcting me. You're absolutely right. Kyoto was carbon, yeah. Vancouver was CFCs.
You're not going to get them to stay poor. Imagine you're Xi Jinping, the leader of China. When you were 10 years old, there was a revolution, a cultural revolution in your country, and people came and they put your father in prison. Your mother had to denounce him. Your sister killed herself. And you, no longer enjoying the protection of your formerly powerful father, were sent to a village where you lived in a cave house. And here you are, decades later.
Montreal. I knew it was Canada somewhere. Sorry. I knew the protocol. I thought that was the actual name of the city that the protocol was signed in is probably not the most important part of my point, but I'm glad there's someone in hand with chat with Google, so I don't make that mistake again.
You have clawed your way up the bloody and greasy pole of Chinese politics to be the undisputed supreme leader of the very Communist Party that destroyed your family. And you know that the main thing you have to do to survive and to stay in power is to deliver the one thing that the people of China want: prosperity, economic growth. Where do you think climate change ranks?
I mean, I said it's really weird that he's talking about Xi Jinping wanting economic growth, when they said the vast majority of the economic growth in China happened under Hu Jintao and to a lesser extent Jiang Zemin. So I don't know why he's specifically focusing on Xi Jinping on this particular issue.
On Xi Jinping's list of priorities. A third of all children who live in extreme poverty in the world live in India.
And also, like, the idea that Xi Jinping doesn't care about the environment is literally de facto untrue. Like, let me just pull up Xi Jinping thought on Wikipedia. I understand it's Wikipedia, but humour me, right? Humour me. Go down to point 9 of Xi Jinping thought. coexist well with nature, with energy conservation and environmental protection policies, and contribute to global ecological safety. Literally, this is a person who is adding his own precepts to the ideology of the ruling Chinese Communist Party, and there is literally environmental protections being stated explicitly right there. So he's just not even this again. Turns out the Mr. Kisin's feelings do not agree with the actual facts. And if you look at, for example, the actual policy plan that they have put forward, China has a plan for an energy transition to net zero by 2060. So they're also wanting to engage in this stuff. Now, there is an issue that I think this isn't quick enough, and there are plenty of ecological protesters in China who actually get suppressed by the CCP, and that's bad, obviously. I don't know why I need to state obviously, or why that was bad. It seems pretty obvious to anybody. But at the very least, there is a movement towards an energy transition. And to be fair, China has literally the largest hydroelectric dam in the world. The largest hydroelectric power plant in the world is in China. And the issue that they have is they got a lot of their energy consumption in China changed in, again, the Hu Jintao period, where their population rapidly urbanized. And a lot of their existing energy generation capacity was, as you can see here, 52%, with a large amount of it was coal power. And the amount of which their energy consumption massively skyrocketed in the 2000s because the urban centres in general use a lot more electricity. And so they've not had the chance to be able to change their energy generation sector to be able to compensate. They've had to use their existing coal-fired power stations to be able to do that. But the idea that Xi Jinping has no desire to change the overall makeup of their energy generation when they literally have a net zero plan by 2060, which it's the Chinese Communist Party, so it's not like it's gonna get stymied by anything, any kind of like nagging democracy or anything like that. And even then, as you rightly point out in chat, Zeod, a lot of this energy is being used to manufacture things to be used by people in the West. And it's the exportation of manufacturing that has made China such, a high consumer of energy. And when you look at it, they may be the biggest culprit for regards for overall energy capacity or energy usage and for carbon emissions. When you look at it per capita, they're nowhere near as bad as the United States because, again, they are the biggest country in the world by population. So, again, a lot of this stuff is essentially based upon, I guess, what he just reckons is true, rather than any kind of actual empiricism or research into what he's saying here. So, yeah, do I think that it will happen? I mean, it's clear that there are moves in China to become more environmentally sound, but we shall see. We shall see.
Priorities. A third of all children who live in extreme poverty in the world live in India. That means they are starving and dying of preventable disease. Now, about 15 months ago, my wife got pregnant. Not me, because we're old school.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Zeod. Yeah, the West will always say that they're lowering carbon emissions when all they're actually doing is moving their carbon emissions to countries in the global south for the vast majority of the time. And then they will then what they'll do is they'll go to fucking Davos at the World Economic Forum and say, oh, look at all these plans we have to help the global south out of their malaise. I mean, it's the fucking malaise that you caused. I missed the transphobia. Let me start that segment again.
That means they are starving and dying of preventable disease. Now, about 15 months ago, my wife got pregnant. Not me, because we're old school.
Why is that funny? Right wingers just have the dumbest sense of humor. You're just like, and I think you'll find I am not transgender. And of course, people in Oxford find that funny.
And for 9 months, we talked about what our boy would look like. What he might.
I think you're right, Great Night Jay, in that there is a legitimate anxiety about the lack of decarbonization in Russia specifically. But I think the issue is that Russia is a global exporter of oil and gas. So their economy is reliant on it. So they want to ensure that it becomes less of an issue. That's why I think that if you're going to choose a country in the global south that isn't looking at as much decarbonisation, it's probably Venezuela, as there. And if you look at in Africa, for example, Angola, as these are all petrostates, that their entire economy relies on oil and gas, and these economies are very similar in this regard. Especially because in Angola and in Venezuela, and to a lesser extent Russia, it's mostly being done by state-owned enterprises. So the success of their state relies on there being a demand for the products that they are and the natural resources that they are taking out of the ground and selling on the global markets. But I think that's less of a. I think it's less of a concern with China when they don't have any their state doesn't have any reliance on new global markets for fossil fuels.
Might do when he grows up. We looked at baby scans and videos on YouTube about what the fetus looks like at 9 months and 12 months and 20 months. And eventually he was born. And he is this.
And also, like, his point about India, I find incredibly funny. Just like in Latin America, the people in India who genuinely care about the environment are poor people. In, like, rural Chhattisgarh right now, there is a Maoist insurgency group, a large Maoist insurgency group, who is fighting against the expansion of things like mining into rural communities. And the history of rural India is always actually mostly around environmentalism. So this idea that it's the poor rural communities in India that don't care about environmentalism is again complete nonsense. The people who don't care about environmentalism are the middle class people in urban centres in India who really actually do care, who don't care because they want to continue consuming. There's the poor people. The poor people aren't actually really that fussed about prosperity, quote unquote, as he says here. They want to eat. They want to be able to survive. If they're so poor that they are food insecure, prosperity means nothing to them. They need their base material needs satiated.
This cute little bundle of joy. He's cuter than about 80% of puppies, right? Now, if you said to me that I had a choice, either my son had a serious risk of starving or dying from a preventable disease in the next year, or I could press a button and he would live. He would go to school. He would bring his first girlfriend home. He'd go to university and graduate and become a woke idiot. And then he'd get a job and get married and have children and become a man. But all I have to do is press this button. And for every day of my son's life, a giant plume of CO2 is going to get released into the atmosphere. Now, you're all very...
And the thing is this is such a ridiculous kind of false equivalency because, or might starve and die of preventable diseases. If you're living in the global south, is precisely because people are pressing buttons and launching massive clouds of CO2 into the air that they are more likely to die of preventable diseases and to be dealing with all these issues, right? Food insecurity is a lot of the downwind of things like deforestation, for example. And again, like specifically climate change in India. Literally, it was last year, it was this summer, where there were ground temperatures in central India. I think it was in Rajasthan, I forget exactly where there were ground temperatures of 50 degrees centigrade. Like ground temperatures in India. The country at most risk of economic collapse are the poor communities in India. It's such a complete nonsense point for him to make. I can't believe I missed that when I was reacting to it previously. Again, like literally, you're absolutely right, Comrade Jock. Food insecurity is being made worse specifically because of climate change. And that's why, when you look at it, poor people are the more likely to be environmentalists because they see the direct effect of these environmental policies in these rural communities that they live in the global south. In Asia and Latin America, these places that he thinks are the people who don't care about climate change, which is nonsensical. It's just not true. It's just nonsense.
Very young, and most of you are not parents. Let me tell you something. There is not a parent in the world who would not smash that button so hard their hand bled.
No, because most people aren't morons. A, it's a false equivalency, and B, most people actually do understand that individualism is not going to fix this policy. As you rightly point out in chat, Great Night Jay, they understand that when you actually look at when you live in the real world rather than this weird fucking metaphor world that he's just created out of thin air, they understand that solutions that actually create the livable society that these people want requires the ability for people to be able to look at problems and come to collective solutions for them. It's a nonsensical non sequitur.
You are not going to get these people to stay poor. You're not even going to get them to not want to be richer.
But the problem is, again, the issue is about their access to food, which they know and they understand is being exacerbated by climate change. They're not idiots. They're not morons. He's treating the global south, the poor people in the global south, like they're literally stupid when they absolutely are not. On that point, I would highly recommend that he protests against the woke and climate change and increasing his carbon footprint by indulging in self-immolation. Lol, Scribby. But again, I just can't with these people. The Glasgow COP seemed like it was largely poor third world countries who were complaining that something had to be done because the current effects of climate change were already causing them problems. Yeah, you're absolutely right, MCH, 100%.
And so, I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, there is only one thing we can do in this country to stop climate change, and that is to make scientific and technological breakthroughs that will create the clean energy that is not only clean, but also cheap.
Do you know what's great about that? We already have cheap energy that is renewable, right? Why do you think the entirety of Norway is basically at this point powered by hydroelectricity? In Tasmania, in Australia, they generate so much hydroelectric power with their state-owned, HydroTas, the state-owned enterprise that runs the hydroelectricity production in Tasmania. They produce such a massive surplus of energy that they were forced by the Morrison government to sell that energy at cost to mainland Australia, which has a far greater mix on mainland Australia of fossil fuel-based energy, right? The idea that somehow the green energy isn't cheap currently, and that's the reason why we don't do it, because it's not efficient and cheap enough to be worthy of investment, is just... It's so completely and categorically untrue. For two reasons. First of all, we've literally seen a massive spike in fossil fuel prices because of the war in Ukraine. And second of all, is the fact that governments, especially in the West, for example, up until very recently, when it became a proper concern for when environmentalism became a proper concern for these Western countries outside of the global South, the reason why we weren't changing to renewables was because of lobbying from the fossil fuel industry, because these people are incredibly rich and they want to maintain their monopoly on energy generation to be able to maintain their profits. Because that's how the system works. The system works on lobbying. Our democracy is entirely fueled by where the money goes. And these people already, there's a sunk cost fallacy to this as well. These people are also already invested in the infrastructure that they need to continue this fossil fuel extraction. That even if engaging in production of renewables was way cheaper and way more efficient and way more worthy of investment, they already have sunk the cost into the infrastructure that they have on the fossil fuel industry already. Plus, they have de facto control over the limited deposits, so they know that the only way to continue their profit motive that they have, is to ensure that there is always demand for the raw materials that they are extracting to be able to use in the economy. And that's why we've not properly divested from these things, because of lobbyism, especially, for example, in the United States, which is the biggest polluter in the world, per capita. And as someone points out correctly in chat, the people who genuinely care about climate change right now, who are the ones pressing, up until this point, until Western countries got with the times, were people in the global South, who he's saying are people who don't care about climate change. It's just definitively incorrect. It's everything in this speech essentially was just completely incorrect.
And no, thank you. And I want everyone to get home on time today, which is not going to happen. And the only thing that wokeness has to offer in exchange is to brainwash bright young minds like you to believe that you are victims, to believe that you have no agency, to believe that...
I mean, we do believe that we have agency, but the belief is that the relative agency is lower because of the power structures that exist, right? Again, because we have, unlike liberal idiots, we have the ability to be able to critique systems with material analysis, which he doesn't want to do. He's thinking, oh, well, the reason why we're in the position that we're in is because it's just better. It's just how things have worked right now, and we need to be able to ensure that the market can solve these things because everything has to work within the market. Like, no. There are incentive structures at play here that have ensured that even the most utilitarian policies overall as a society are being hampered by individual special interests that try and hamstring this legislation and hamstring this political policy and hamstring our discussion, right? ExxonMobil in the 70s did plenty of research showing the environmental damage that they were going to do, and they admitted that they didn't release that information because they knew they had to benefit their shareholders. And you cannot put good people in charge to stop that happening because the incentive structures are the problem. It's a pattern of human behavior. It's a modality. It's nothing to do with the bad people doing the wrong things or things not being efficient enough. These people had vested interests and they wanted to protect them because shareholder value is all that matters under capitalism. We may have at least some amount of agency, but we have far less agency than gigantic oil corporations. Yeah, exactly. Comrade Jock, you're absolutely right. We don't believe we don't have agency. We just understand the limits of individual action. 100%. 100%.
That what you must do to improve the world is to complain, is to protest, is to throw...
I mean, this guy is saying, right, he literally started this speech by extolling the virtues of the Enlightenment and liberal society. How do you think we got that liberal society in the first place? How do you think we got to the liberal democracies that we live in today? Is it because we asked nicely and made it look more efficient? No. England went into civil war. France got choppy with their monarchs. There were revolutions. There were people complaining and throwing proverbial soup at proverbial paintings to be able to change society for the better. I understand he comes from Russia and he has spent a lot of his time dealing with the issues that arise because of poor management under the Soviet Union. And he views revolutionary acts under what he sees and believes and understands to be the failures of the Russian Revolution that created the Soviet Union. But you can't just then say that that means that all revolutions are bad when the French Revolution was demonstrably good. When literally the Enlightenment values that he says at the start of his speech that he values only became societal policy because people decided to pick up their pitchforks and get it for themselves. Right? Obviously, in the liberal democracies we have today, it's kind of frowned upon when you try and execute your monarchs. So what you do is you use political policy, you use protest, and use agitation, and you use democracy, you use every single method at your disposal to be able to change public policy. And that's how things work now under democracy, where it doesn't work when you're trying to move your society on from feudalism and monarchy. Yeah, but true, but Cromwell was actually the original wokester because he banned Christmas. It was the woke roundheads were just too complaining. I remember, Robespierre, the actual king of woke, although not the king of woke, the elected representative of woke at the time. Again, like, this is such a completely nonsensical point of view for him to take, as if all societal change that's been positive, even the ones that he believes in it and publicly supports in this very speech, were only ever achieved by what he is now denouncing that woke quote-unquote people are doing currently to try and engender societal change. It's so nonsensical. He managed to visit Oxford Uni and managed to contradict himself by both invalid and unsound arguments while utilising philosophy, psychology, and anthropology disingenuously. Well done. Robespierre, the guy that called Chairman woke, probably.
Soup on paintings. And we on this side of the house are not on this side of the house because we do not wish to improve the world. We sit on this side of the house because we know that the way to improve the world is to work, is to create, it is to build. And the problem with woke culture is that it's trained too many young minds like yours to forget about that. Thank you very much.
How is it? Nothing that you've said has led you to that conclusion. That doesn't make any sense. How have we got to this point? Yeah, woke people don't know how to build. They've never built anything in their lives. Explanation, evidence, source, citation needed. What? Exactly, holy non sequitur, Batman. You're right, Black Move. Good to have you in chat. You've missed a hilarious segment, which was the most. It was like he was kind of firing bullshit at us, rapid fire, using a chain gun. Again, a lot of this stems down to this idea that somehow all leftists who have a problem with climate change all genuinely only believe that the solution is degrowth, when that's just a fantasy that he has in his head. It doesn't actually map onto proper leftist advocacy, not actually when you look at the activist groups themselves or when you look at their political parties. Neither of those two things are the case. Like, and if there's one thing the leftist movement that he denounces, for example, they probably, I mean, they're not woke, but they follow similar precepts, right? If you look at, for example, the Soviet Union, for example, or Yugoslavia, they may have been tyrannical, especially the Soviet Union, but if there's one thing they definitely did, it was build, right, and innovate. Like the Soviet Union sent the first people into space. That may have not been societally useful, but it was certainly innovative and exploratory. I'm going to make logical arguments, you idiots. Russian toilets, sad Indian children, paintings covered in soup. Boom, debunked. I yield the balance of my time. I mean, I'm based in Tito Pilled as well, but yeah, like, what do you think the CCP are doing? Like, whilst we're stuck in the Stone Age, driving our crappy hatchbacks around in huge amounts of traffic, driving down the M40 to get to Birmingham from London because HS2 is still a long way away from being constructed. China is busy actually building loads of high-speed rail whilst committing cultural genocide, but let's forget about that bit. At the very least, the government that's actually building stuff at the moment is China, which I find very funny. Like, literally, in Yugoslavia, the construction cooperative in Yugoslavia at the time, well, it's not really a cooperative, it was a construction company with a workers' council. I'm not going to go into the specifics. They literally were deployed by Tito to go and build infrastructure in the global south to help build international leftism. Maybe we're all just too emotional to understand his bulletproof fact and logic. Well, true, Comrade Jog. Well, that was a load of shit. That was nonsensical, completely not based in material or factual reality. And I stumbled through that. I wasn't my usual erudite self, but quite frankly, the idea that this went viral and people took like this to be some kind of this man destroyed wokeism. People must be the people who view this must be genuinely stupid. I mean, actually, that's unfair of me. They're probably not stupid, but to know where China is in the global hunger index, or to understand that stats are being manipulated by not being shown to be per capita, or not to know like the nuances of the rural-urban divide in India and Latin America. If you don't know these things, then you're not going to be able to push back on the things that he's saying. Obviously, there were idiotic non sequiturs in there as well, but a bunch of the basic premises that his argument was based upon just weren't true. But unless you know that those aren't true, how are you going to push back against it? Because it sounds very compelling, unless you understand where China lie in the global hunger index, right? Do you see what I mean? And taking no interjections was a shrewd move for all involved. Yeah, true. Yeah, because I remember there were the points that I raised, I could see people wanting to interject. I mean, again, like, if you push misinformation or you lie with facts, because you remember the facts don't lie, but people lie with facts all the time, right? He literally cancelled their free speech. So true, Great Night J. So true. What an anti-free speech, authoritarian wokery. That's what that is. Really and truly. But again, if the comments are there being, lionising his position or whatever, Scribby, because they aren't scrutinizing the claims that he's made, then that's a problem with him for not properly presenting things in a factual manner.